Good afternoon, my name is Sharon Tao, and today I'll be presenting the first of the UNICEF Education Think Pieces. This one will focus on the theme of gender inequity, girls' education in particular. Now, just to give you some background, I'm a senior education and gender advisor at Cambridge Education, and I've worked on issues of gender inequity in contexts such as Tanzania, Uganda, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Now, although these contexts vary and offer different challenges to girls' education, there are some salient issues that are common amongst these and other contexts, and I'll be discussing some of these today. So, when we speak about gender inequity, we often refer to the barriers to education that affect countless groups of children, such as children with disabilities, children from an ethnic minority, children displaced by emergency, children living in extreme poverty. And while both boys and girls make up these excluded groups, the constraints that are experienced, be it due to poverty, displacement, or disability, are compounded and multiplied when they're experienced by girls. So both boys and girls' education suffers if they are expected to work and bring income to their families, but girls will have the added constraints of extra domestic duties, vulnerability to sexual harassment, menstruation, and in some contexts, early marriage. So these are the reasons why this think piece has a focus on girls' education. It unpacks why girls' achievements remain low, despite a number of girls' education programs in the Eastern and Southern African region. And it also puts forward a new approach, one that aims to bring together girls' education programs so that more substantial and accelerated change can be achieved. So, tremendous progress has been made towards gender parity in primary level. However, over the following years, girls' presence and participation in school starts to drop, leading to poor completion and transition into secondary school. And this is due to multiple forms of constraint, both inside and outside of schools. So before I was talking about household poverty, because it affects both boys and girls, as it pulls them out of school due to costs of uniforms, materials, exam fees, and then pushes them into providing labor and working for the family. But for girls, these challenges are compounded by additional constraints, such as cooking, cleaning, caring for siblings, having inadequate sanitary products for menstruation, and early marriage, as dowries often offset family poverty. Then these barriers are compounded by barriers within schools and classrooms. So teachers can have unconscious or conscious biases or preferences towards male pupils. Textbooks often depict men in positions of authority and power, which starts to shape and limit girls' aspirations. School cleaning protocols frequently reinforce gender norms, as girls are often responsible for the more domestic roles and duties. So then, more extreme differences between girls and boys occur when sexual harassment and violence is directed towards girls, and insufficient protection reporting systems leave them vulnerable. And so these inadequate systems are tied to failings at district and national levels, whereby sexual harassment policies or teacher codes of conduct are poorly disseminated, implemented, and enforced, if they exist at all. And this can be due to a lack of gender prioritization and political will within governments, which is often a result of broader social and cultural norms that don't necessarily value or recognize equality between women and men. So apologies for the small text. This figure actually features in the think piece itself. So if you happen to have the PDF or hard copy, please feel free to reference that and look at that. But this is a diagram that starts to illustrate and visualize the different levels of constraint that I've been describing. So if we look at the center where we have the girl and her capability to learn, we can see how all the different types and levels of constraint compound on that. So we can start first at the home and community level, which is sort of the most directly related to her, and that's where we see extra domestic duties, constraints of having to contribute to family income, lack of professional role models, prioritization of boys' education, particularly if poverty is an issue, early marriage, lack of sanitary products during menstruation. This is where a lot of those issues can constrain a girl's capability to learn. And then these are compounded at the school and classroom level, where you have teachers who haven't necessarily had any in-service training on gender-responsive pedagogy, which then leads to prioritization of boys, leadership roles only going to boys, schools, chores, and cleaning, reinforcing gender roles, teaching and learning materials, certainly reinforcing traditional gender roles, and teachers not realizing that they should unpack that or critique those roles within those materials. That's where infrastructure, such as inadequate toilets, come into play, lack of guidance counselors, sexual harassment by pupils and teachers, low female representation in the teaching staff and senior management, that sort of thing. That starts to compound the constraints at the home and community level. And then on top of these two layers, you have the system and policy constraints. And that's where we see inadequate support, gender support and monitoring at the district level, inadequate pre-service training on gender-responsive pedagogy, inadequate recruitment of female managers and teachers, insufficient policies, and lack of implementation of the policies, and lack of gender awareness in the broader Ministry of Education. Again, all of this being underpinned by broader social norms that deprioritize gender throughout government. So that being said, there are many organizations that have implemented or are implementing interventions to address constraints. Some notable interventions are cash transfers to parents to keep girls in schools, provision of sanitary products and girls' clubs. There are also general education programs that try to mainstream gender within their broader capacity development with teachers, communities, and district education officers. And these interventions are very laudable, but also problematic, as they generally focus on only one or two constraints at a particular level of the education system. And projects that focus on constraints at the school level can easily be undermined by constraints within the home, and vice versa. And this often occurs when you have education programs that have girls as their sole beneficiaries, and they automatically assume that they are gender responsive and thus overlook the other forms of constraint. It should be also noted that there are interventions at the national level. For example, GPE, UNGAI, and UNICEF have recently been working on a guidance note that supports ministries of education to develop gender-responsive education sector plans. Again, extremely laudable. But within this guidance, there is no acknowledgement of all the girls' education programs that are currently being implemented at the grassroots level. And there's no attempt to even harness these, which could be very powerful. So, and that being said, it's not surprising that research on girls' education has concluded that the greatest impact occurs when a combination of different interventions from that national level to the grassroots level come together to provide a holistic approach to constraint. So again, another diagram, again, apologies for the small text, and this is also in the think piece if you'd like to refer to it. So this diagram starts to try to map some of the constraints that I discussed in that first figure against some of the interventions that I've also just talked about. So you'll see the yellow bars or rows delineate the different levels of constraint, the home and community, classroom and school, and district and national levels. Above that, you'll start to see numbers 5 through 18, and that indicates the different ages of girls. Above those ages are the intended and often actual ages of the grades that girls enter at those ages. So for example, the first bar row shows that at the pre-primary and year 1, 2, 3 grades, girls are meant to enter between 5 and 7. However, if there's a delay in enrollment, they start to actually enter these grades from 8, 9, 10. And again, you'll see the same for years 4 through 5, 6 through 7, lower and upper and secondary. And if there's compounded absenteeism through the early years of primary school, that's when you start seeing girls enter P6 through 7 at the ages of 11 or 12, 13. Again, All of these are sort of contextually bound, but they are indicative and kind of show you what starts to happen when constraint occurs. What we start to see, though, is that the most sort of pivotal ages are those surrounding puberty. So if we looked at the home and community level, we see that all throughout a girl's age, they will be affected by constraints such as family poverty, parents not having the funds for school costs, or prioritization of boys' education. But then from 8, 9, 10, when girls start getting older, they become more responsible for domestic work, the cooking and cleaning and caring for siblings, contributing to family income. And then at that sort of puberty level around 13, that's when girls experience the more concerted constraints that only affect girls. Things like the need for dowry and early marriage, lack of sanitary products for menstruation, lack of sexual reproductive health information, transactional sex for school fees when poverty is an issue, and that leading to early pregnancy, and a very complex process for reporting abuse, so therefore parents start to avoid it, that sort of thing. At the classroom level, again, you'll see some constraints that affect girls irrespective of age. So those are the things like teachers' inadequate training on gender-responsive pedagogy, and that very much limiting, what girls can do and how they can participate in classrooms. But then as they get older, and particularly as they start reaching puberty, again, you start to see the real difference between how girls and boys are treated. There are inadequate hygiene facilities for female students, particularly when menstruation's an issue. Teasing and bullying, sexual abuse by teachers and students, transactional sex, no safety or reporting policies for cases of abuse. And then at the district and national level, you'll see constraints that affect girls, again, irrespective of age. This sort of inadequate policies on gender and sexual harassment, inadequate recruitment and deployment of female teachers, the lack of gender structures at the district and national level. Those sort of things. What you'll start to see then on the right-hand column in the gray are the different interventions that very specifically try to address some of these constraints, like cash transfers for the family to keep girls in school, social behavior change communications to try to shift gender norms or practices and beliefs, say around early marriage, that sort of thing. At the school level, you'll see a lot of work on in-service teacher training to provide information on gender-responsive pedagogy and nonviolent classroom management, that sort of thing. You'll see WASH interventions for toilets, sexual reproductive health education. Certainly girls' clubs can be very powerful. And then at the national level, you'll see interventions like the policy level, or policy development, the GPE, UNGAI, and UNICEF work to support ministries to develop gender-responsive education sector plans. These are all, again, very laudable and very important interventions, but what's problematic is that they tend to focus on certain constraints at certain levels of the education system. And unless they start to work together in a coordinated fashion from the micro to the macro level, none of them will provide a holistic approach to all of these constraints that compound a girl's capability to learn. So this is why a different approach is needed to address constraint, because girls' education programs are not leading to effective change. And this is because they focus on only one or two constraints at a particular level of the education system, as I just mentioned. They are uncoordinated, so their targets, beneficiary age range of the girls, timeframes, and geographical scopes vary, and they often work in isolation from each other, which can lead to duplication and overlap. So there's a need for a coordinated strategy in which interventions, however small and specifically targeted, or however macro at the national level, all work towards a broader objective, which is holistically addressing constraint from that macro to micro level. And this requires an approach that looks at the problem in the round and coordinates interventions towards a common strategy. And this can be done through supporting ministries of education to develop a comprehensive theory of change to underpin their gender-responsive education sector plans or policies, and using this theory of change to guide implementation, as it provides a strategy and coordination mechanism for all system actors and organizations implementing girls' education programs. So the first step is developing a theory of change that takes into account all the different types and levels of constraint within a particular context, as this can provide a roadmap for program coordination. So the following figure on the next slide is an illustrative and generic theory of change that attempts to do this by starting with the different levels of constraint identified in the first figure and the corresponding interventions that I discussed in the second figure. And both constraints and interventions should be tailored to the context in which this approach is being used, and this requires discussions with key stakeholders, particularly girls, to validate, elaborate on, and prioritize constraints. And based on prioritized constraints, interventions can then be prioritized at all levels. And if these interventions can be implemented simultaneously and in the same context, the hypothesis is that more gender-responsive systems, schools, and homes and communities will begin to develop. And when that happens, girls' educational access, completion, and transition will be significantly improved. So again, this diagram is also in the think piece, although in a vertical version. And what it does is starts with those different constraints that we've discussed from figure 1 at the system and policy level, school and classroom level, home and community level. We've also added individual barriers or constraints, which are the fact that girls lack the confidence and knowledge about their rights and whether they can claim them, and that all of these different barriers are underpinned by deeply embedded social norms. So at that point, we can start to map onto these constraints the different interventions that we spoke about in the second figure. And these different activities being the gender-responsive education sector plans, interventions like in-service training at school and classroom level, home and community interventions, individual knowledge and empowerment activities, and shifting the social norms. The intent then is if all of these interventions are happening, they start to lead to outputs such as more gender-responsive systems and policies, more gender-responsive schools and classrooms, gender-responsive homes and communities, girls and boys knowing and claiming their rights, and gender-responsive social norms, which, as you can guess, take a very long time and care to shift. But taken together, if these outputs are all occurring at the same time and in the same context, they will produce outcomes such as greater access for girls to education, greater retention, and greater transition, not only to secondary school, but to tertiary education and the labor market. And the overall impact of this will be a better educated and empowered female population. And now, although change is not this straightforward or linear, what this approach provides is a contextualized roadmap of what needs to be done, and it can keep all stakeholders aligned and focused. So who should own this transformative approach? Well, Ministry of Education planners should be supported to develop their contextualized theory of change, which can be used to underpin an education sector plan in order to harness girls' education programming that's happening at the grassroots level. And then ministry implementers can use this approach, this theory of change, as a roadmap for mapping out who's doing what and what needs to be done. So this is not an easy task, as implementation often falls on the shoulders of ministry gender units, divisions, or desks, which are often institutionally weak, understaffed, and under-resourced. And this lack of resource is often why we see power imbalances between donors and gender officers, whereby officers end up following donors' money and getting pulled from one project to another. But for those of us working to strengthen education systems and system actors, particularly UNICEF education specialists, this is where support should be given. So After contextualizing the theory of change and approach, all projects that have a focus on girls' education should align with it in order to ensure the greatest reach, scope, and reduction of duplication. Ministries should be supported to map current programs against the intervention levels of the approach or theory of change in order to determine who's doing what where, if there are misalignments, duplications, or gaps, whether they're geographical, the type of intervention, the target ages of girls, etc. In order to fill any gaps that may appear, ministries should be supported to develop an application process and vetting criteria for future activities and interventions. And organizations planning to implement a girls' education project should be sensitized to the ministry's approach and roadmap, and then submit a proposal or application detailing how they address gaps that have been identified. Now, this is not meant to promote a culture of over-regulation, but it is meant to ensure that all organizations' priorities and projects are aligned with a coherent and holistic ministry vision for girls' education. So this approach can also be used as a clear roadmap to keep the ministry, system actors, organizations, and projects focused and aligned. And one way to ensure this is to create a girls' education network that allows for stakeholders and approved or potential projects to meet in order to share progress, knowledge, materials, best practice, get updates on new and current projects contributing to the approach, and coordinate efforts where it's relevant. And such a network could exist at both the national and district levels in order to ensure that all parties aiming to improve girls' education are aligned with the roadmap and, as a consequence, with each other. So in conclusion, we should acknowledge that there is a lot of good work being done to improve girls' education, but poor learning outcomes for girls persist, and the reason for this is because there are multiple constraints on girls, and some constraints, particularly cultural and religious norms, take time and care to shift. Another part of the problem is that efforts to tackle constraints are often too disparate, too narrowly focused, too short-term, and too small to have a major impact on their own. And efforts at national levels do not adequately harness these efforts at the grassroots levels. So that is why this think piece has put forward a new approach to girls' education that brings together gender-responsive sector plans and policies with grassroots actors in a transformative approach to change. It uses a consultative process to prioritize constraints and the interventions needed to address them, and uses the approach as a common roadmap and coordination mechanism to ensure that all project interventions are contributing to the same objectives and goal. This approach is not an easy one, as development and ownership of an integrated approach on leadership relies on a great deal of leadership and capacity from ministries of education. And that's why it's imperative for partners, donors, and UNICEF education specialists to actively engage in and promote a coordinated approach and support ministry leadership and capacity development to this end. It's only by working together in this way, from the macro to micro level, and with government and non-governmental partners, can we accelerate, sustain, and transform our investments in the education and lives of girls. Thank you.